Thank you for joining me on this trip through one of the scariest cases in history. When set in the Appalachian Mountains, there is a name that still gives people chills, a name that is connected to mysterious deaths, a house that is far away from everything else, and secrets that have been kept hidden for generations. Evelyn Burke was from a family that was known for having a lot of power in the area, but there was something much darker going on behind her pretty face. The story behind this video was made up just for fun and relaxation. Any resemblance to real people, live or dead, is just a coincidence. In eastern Kentucky, the Burke family's land was on the edge of a small town. It was in a mountainous area with bad roads and miles of thick forest separating neighbors. The first reports started to spread in 1908. Travelers going through the area talked about a beautiful woman who gave people a place to stay when they got lost on the winding tracks. It was said that she was incredibly beautiful, with clear eyes and a smile that seemed to hold secrets from long ago. Few people could say no to her because her voice was soft and almost hypnotic. By local standards, the Burke house was a big building. It had 3 stories and was made of dark wood. It was surrounded by hundreds of years-old oak trees that blocked the sun even during the day. Evelyn's grandpa built the house. He made a lot of money in coal mining and then mysteriously disappeared years before his granddaughter came to live there. County records show that the family didn't have many employees and didn't have many official guests. It looked like that house was in a different world from the expectations of society at the time. Like many women in her position at the time, Evelyn never got married. Some people said she had never thought about dating again because she had lost a fiancé when she was young. Some people said she liked being alone and that there was something wrong with her. What no one asked about was her, being able to get people's attention. When she showed up in the closest town, she always made people feel both interested and uneasy. The men were interested in her. Women turned their heads away. A businessman named Thomas Whitmore walked by the Burke estate in the late fall. His wagon broke down near the mansion's front door. He was coming from Virginia and going to a nearby town for business. Evelyn showed up before he could decide what to do. She asked him to help and invited him to dinner while the workers fixed the axle that was broken. Thomas said yes and was thankful for the surprise kindness. That was the last time anyone saw him living. Records from the local sheriff's office show that Thomas's wife called the police 2 weeks later because she was worried about her husband's whereabouts. The investigations led to the Burke house, where Evelyn was polite to the police. She told them that Thomas had eaten there, but she also said that he would be leaving early the next morning. His wagon was found miles away, empty, but there were no signs of harm. People who went missing on their own made the report, which was pretty common back then when the borders were still wild. Thomas wasn't the only one, though. In the years that followed, other men who had been traveling through the area went missing. They were always traveling alone and didn't have any close family members who could have asked for answers. People in the area started to avoid that road and take longer ones instead. Evelyn kept coming into town every once in a while to buy groceries and say a few words. Nobody dared to directly accuse her. After all, she was a Burke, and people from that family were powerful. The house had a design secret that not many people knew about. Under the main floor, there was another level with a room cut into the mountain rock. This room was originally built to store coal, but it was used for something else over time. The walls were thick, and the way in was hidden by a heavy door with shelves on it. It was somewhere where noise couldn't get out, and there was always darkness. Records from the county show a troubling pattern. There were at least 7 men who went missing near the Burke farm between 1908 and 1914. All of them were visitors, traders, or workers who were traveling. Some people left their things at local inns, along with unsent letters and promises to return that were never kept. faraway families sent telegrams that were not answered. At the time, Harold Brennan was the sheriff, and he kept track of each event with rising anger. But he couldn't do anything because he didn't have any solid proof. Evelyn stuck to a strange schedule. A lot of salted meat, jams, and food that would last for months were bought by her, according to the shopkeepers who served her. She also bought strong chains, heavy-duty tools, and padlocks. When asked, she said that she had been taking care of the land by herself since her parents died, and that she needed to be ready for anything. At first glance, the answer made sense, but it also raised some questions. There were parts of the Burke house that made it perfect for being alone. Because the basement windows were small and high up, they only let in soft light during the day. To get to the land, you had to cross a wooden bridge over a creek, which was closed for weeks in the winter. It looked like the house was built to separate the inside from the outside world and keep secrets from being found. Something happened in 1912 that almost changed everything. A person named Samuel Porter got away. He was asked to spend the night at the house because his horse had been hurt on the path. He woke up in the middle of the night in a dark, cold place and realized he wasn't in the guest room anymore. Despite putting in a lot of effort, he was able to get through and run into the bush. When he got to the next town, his clothes were torn, and he was hallucinating about being watched in the dark by eyes in the rooms below. The police thought he was upset, and thought it might be because he had a fever or had drunk dirty water. Samuel stuck to his story and talked about how the house was built on the inside in. Detail, which seemed impossible for someone who had only eaten there. He talked about chains that were attached to stone walls, the smell of mold and decay, and voices that could be heard in a huge underground area. Sheriff Brennan made notes, but when he went to look into it, Evelyn greeted him again with courtesy. They denied doing anything wrong and gave him a tour of the house. The basement that the sheriff saw was like any other. Shelves with jams and jellies, water barrels, and well-organized farming tools. No hidden rooms or chains. Samuel was thought to not be trustworthy, possibly. Hurt by something that happened in the forest. He quickly left the area, and his claims were not taken seriously. Records from many years later showed that Samuel never got to where he was supposed to go. He was eaten up by the vastness of the mountains somewhere along the way. Evelyn kept living her quiet life. She occasionally went to town social events, gave money to the local church, and kept up the image of an odd but good woman. Her wealth stayed the same. Her taxes were paid on time, and she didn't file an official complaint. Could be used against her. People in the area saw the Burke house as a landmark, an old building that had seen the growth of the area. Not many people were brave enough to ask what really happened inside those old walls, but the forest holds secrets that will finally come out. Strange things were found by hunters in the more remote areas around the land. Things like fabric pieces caught on branches, left behind personal items, and marks on the ground that looked like something heavy was pulled. Nothing clear-cut, just pieces of a bigger story that no one could fully put together. People didn't want to think about it too much or look into it further than the surface. Even so, there are some facts that are better left buried. There were many things that didn't make sense about Evelyn Burke's image. Some saw her as a symbol of the aristocratic decadence of old Appalachian families, of women who received huge fortunes but lived alone on run-down estates. Others saw her as just strange and thought she had chosen solitude over society norms. No one said out loud that they had doubts about her, but when they looked into her deep eyes, they all felt heavy. The disappearances were rarely talked about in the area's newspapers. In 1915, a local newspaper wrote a vague piece about how dangerous it was to drive through remote areas and how mountain roads needed to be improved. People who were hurt were named in the text, but no names were used or fingers were pointed. It seemed like there was a hidden agreement of silence, or a choice by everyone not to mess up the current order. In the end, questioning a Burke meant questioning the system of power that had kept that community going for generations. Evelyn had a strange talent for finding people who were weak. She never talked to guys who were traveling with other people or who had important plans that needed to be kept right away. People that no one would consistently look for were always her victims. Men who didn't have strong roots and who moved from city to city looking for work. She showed them kindness just when they needed it the most. As night fell and the forest grew scary, the promise of a warm meal and a roof over their heads seemed like a blessing. It was almost like the house was alive. Visitors on occasion, the few who were welcomed and then sent away, talked about feeling uneasy all the time. At certain times, the wood would creak. Even with all the windows shut, cold air flowed through the hallways. Dark spots seemed to move around where they shouldn't. Movement. The old age of the house was blamed by some for these feelings. Others chose to think that places like this take in the energy of the events they see. When the country joined the First World War in 1917, a lot of young men from the area left to serve. The group shrank, and people became less alert to strange behavior. Evelyn took advantage of the fact that everyone was busy at the time. There were more stories of people going missing, but many of them were put down to the chaos of war and the disorganization of means for communicating. Families thought that their loved ones had joined the military on the spur of the moment or moved to bigger places to find work. In companies that make weapons. In the county archives, there is a letter from October 1918 by a guy named Robert Fielding to his brother in Ohio. This letter is very upsetting. Robert says in it that he accepted Mrs. Burke's offer to dinner and that he plans to leave the next day. After many years, the letter was found in a stack of undeliverable mail that got lost during a changing how the local post office is set up. Robert never made it to Ohio. His brother waited for news until 1920, when he finally went to Kentucky to try to figure out the last steps his lost brother took. The person who was most insistent was Robert's brother, Edward Fielding. He spent weeks talking to people in the area and looking at old records while following the path Robert would have taken. With each clue, he got closer to the Burke home. When he finally talked to Evelyn about it, she kept her calm and polite attitude. She said yes, that Robert had eaten there, liked his company, and felt bad that he couldn't do more to help. Edward thought she was lying when he left the meeting, but he couldn't prove it. Edward tried to persuade the police to look into the basement of the mansion more carefully. At the time, the sheriff, who was replacing Harold Brennan, who had died in 1916, didn't want to do it. He said that they had already searched the land and that they couldn't go against a good citizen's rights without a good reason. Solid proof. Edward kept trying and even offered to pay for a more thorough check, but he was turned down. He went back to Ohio with only doubts and an empty feeling that would never go away because he was angry and couldn't do anything about it legally. There was no more war. After the survivors went back home, things slowly went back to normal in the woods. Evelyn Burke was always there, and her presence made people admire her and fear her without saying so. Her house stood there, a quiet witness to the secrets that the stone and wood walls held, kept safe with complete loyalty. The Appalachian region went through small changes over the next few years, but the Burke house seemed to be stuck in a different time. Other homes were getting power and phones to make them more modern, but Evelyn's house kept its original look. At night, oil lamps were still used to light the rooms. The artesian well was still the only way to get water, and the road to get there wasn't built. It seemed like she purposely cut herself off from any contact with the outside world that could help. No disturbance is wanted. In 1921, the people in the area held a loose census to keep county records up to date. Martin Crawford, a government worker, was sent to check out the more remote homes, including the Burke house. He got there in the middle of a wet spring afternoon. The hills were covered in thick fog, and the air was heavy with humidity. Evelyn received him politely as usual and offered him tea while she answered some paperwork questions. Martin noticed little things that bothered him, things he couldn't understand. Describe. On the main hallway's wooden floor, there were stains that looked like they had been scrubbed over and over but never went away fully. He couldn't quite put his finger on what the strange smell in the house was, a mix of mold, wet dirt, and something else. While they were talking, Martin heard a metallic creak coming from downstairs, and then there was quiet. His question made Evelyn say that it was just the old pipes and that the house had its quirks after being lived in for so long. The answer made sense, but it made Martin feel uneasy. Martin asked to go to the bathroom before he left. Evelyn thought about it for a moment before showing the way. As he walked down the hall, he saw a door that was only half open. It led to stairs that went down into the dark. Because he was interested, he took a few steps toward the hole, but Evelyn's voice stopped him. She had quietly walked up behind him. Her voice was still polite, but it had an enigmatic quality to it. She told him to use the bathroom upstairs because the one in the basement was leaking. Martin did what he was told, but the steps he had seen before stayed in his mind. When Martin got back to the county office, he told his coworkers about his trip. He talked about how unsettling the house felt, the strange sounds it made, and how Evelyn wouldn't let him go into certain areas. The top workers looked at each other in a deep way. George Tillman, who had worked there for 30 years, was one of them who pulled Martin, took him away, and told him about the rumors that had been going around for many years. He talked about the Burke heiresses' disappearances, the unproven fears, and the worries that people had about them. George said that there had been several failed attempts to investigate over the years. The Burke family had a bigger impact than what was obvious at first glance. They paid for the building of the local church, gave land for the city graveyard, and helped families who were having a hard time. When things are scarce. This network of favors made an unseen wall of thanks and fear that made it socially impossible to accuse Evelyn of anything. To question the Burkes was to question the community's very basis. Martin was upset by these new details, and he spent weeks going through old records to try to find trends in the disappearances. He found that between 1908 and 1921, at least 12 men had gone missing near the Burke farm. All of them had the same traits. They went by themselves because they didn't have any family in the area and didn't have any strong ties to the area. Most of them had always been close to that isolated mansion when their last known location was established. There were too many similarities to ignore them. He tried to get the sheriff to start looking into things again. He wrote a long document that listed all the events and made connections between them, saying that there was enough proof to warrant a full search of the property. But Douglas Whitaker, the realistic sheriff, read everything carefully before talking about how things really stand politically. Anything that is legal would fail in court without a body, reliable witnesses, or physical proof. Also, putting Burke on trial would have consequences that could cost him his job. Martin started writing down everything on his own because he was angry but not beaten. He put together a personal library with copies of records, transcripts of interviews, and maps that showed where the things that belonged to people who went missing were found. His wife saw that he was becoming more and more obsessed, and was worried about the long nights he spent reading papers by candlelight. Martin said that this was okay, because someone had to keep a record, and because the truth would come out in the end, so it was important to have paperwork ready. Martin had a visitor come to his house out of the blue in October 1922. Evelyn Burke showed up in the afternoon, looking as beautiful as ever and bringing a gift basket of fruit she said she had learned from. We heard from people we know that he just had his first child and wanted to celebrate him. On the surface, the discussion seemed friendly, but Martin could read between the lines. She knew about his work and the collection he kept. At the same time, the gift was both a congratulations and a warning. Martin became more careful after that meeting. He kept his papers in a safe place outside of his house and gave copies to a friend in a different city. He kept adding facts as it came up, but he didn't face them. Evelyn, straight up. They knew there were risks when she lived in his house and was close to his family. He understood that the person he was dealing with didn't follow normal social rules and had clear limits on how much patience they could have. As the months went by, more disappearances were recorded, though not as often. It's possible that Evelyn had chosen more carefully, or maybe the fact that there was more traffic on the roads because the economy grew after the war made what she did risky. No one knew what was going on with the house. Its secrets kept safe by thick walls and the unknowing help of a community that didn't want to see what was clear. Martin kept his lone vigil going, waiting patiently for the day when the proof would be so strong that it could not be argued with. The country went through big changes in the 1920s, but the mountains of Kentucky stayed mostly unaffected by these changes. In the Appalachians, small towns kept traditions and rhythms that didn't seem to change, while big cities welcomed the Jazz Age and sped up modernization. The Burke Mansion stayed a sad landmark in that area. It was a building that resisted time and pushed back progress. Even though Evelyn was over 50 years old in 1925, she looked extremely young. Some silver strands were starting to show in her hair, but she stood straight and moved with ease. She wasn't seen in town very often anymore. Instead, she sent messengers to get goods every so often. This extra privacy led to new stories. Some people said she was getting sick. Others thought she had just grown tired of social rules and customs. As always, the truth stayed hidden. A young writer named Benjamin Cole came to the area around this time. He liked to write for a newspaper in Louisville and read about life in the woods, old traditions, and local stories. Benjamin wanted to do well. He saw those stories from the country as a chance to build his professional image. When he heard rumors about the strange Burke A's and the unsolved disappearances, he felt like he had to become a reporter. Benedict talked to locals for weeks and slowly earned their trust. He learned that many people had stories to tell but were afraid to say them out loud. People talked in private areas of bars and on porches away from other people. They always looked around nervously to see who might be listening. From these conversations, a pattern began to show itself. Everyone knew someone who had gone missing near the Burke farm, but no one could or would make the connection in public. Martin Crawford was the one who made the final choice, to let Benjamin look through his paperwork. He knew that an outside reporter could have the freedom he didn't have after keeping that information secret for years. They met in secret in an old hunting house that no one else was in. When Martin opened his files, he saw years of careful study. Benjamin was amazed by how much work went into it, how the cases were clearly linked, and how a clear pattern emerged from the data. But Benjamin also saw what the real trouble was. Everything was based on circumstances. At that time, people often went missing in rural places. In order to get away from their bills, men left for faraway places and died in accidents in the woods where their bodies were never found. For that to be a story that could be published, he would need something more solid, something that could stand up to the scrutiny of editors and maybe even the law. Benjamin chose to go straight to the point. On a foggy March morning in 1926, he went to the Burke house and said that he was a reporter looking for an interview. Evelyn said hello to him with. They seemed surprised, but they agreed to talk. She took him to a living room with old furniture where coffee was being served. Benjamin asked carefully worded questions about the family background, how they lived alone, and the rumors that were going around. Evelyn answered with the poise she had practiced. She talked about her grandfather's legacy, how hard it is to take care of a big house by yourself, and how people always worry about things they don't fully understand. When Benjamin brought up the disappearances, as a show of sadness, she sighed. She said that travelers always got lost in those mountains and that she had helped many people over the years. It wasn't fair to blame her for the deaths that happened because of geography and luck, she said. Benjamin paid close attention to everything going on during the talk. He noticed how carefully Evelyn chose her words, how she avoided giving specifics, and how she expertly sidestepped questions that were making him feel bad. Her eyes were especially interesting. They were clear and deep, and they seemed to be judging him. For every move. It was clear that she was very smart behind that country lady persona. She knew exactly how to show herself to get what she wanted. Before he left, Benjamin asked to take a picture of the land to go with his story. Evelyn looked like she wasn't sure, but she agreed as long as he only took pictures of the outside. While Benjamin got his gear ready, she kept an eye on him to make sure he didn't go outside of the designated places. These pictures showed the beautiful, falling-apart house, the sad oak trees, and the bridge over the creek, but nothing that showed what was inside. Benjamin wrote a careful piece back in Louisville. He talked about the strange atmosphere of the area, the disappearances as an interesting event, and Evelyn as a mystery person without directly accusing her. His editor carefully read the text and took out any ideas that could be seen as slanderous. The piece was printed. In April 1926, which caused some attention but not much action. Benjamin was annoyed that his story was so unrealistic, but he knew that news has legal and moral limits. A few months later, Benjamin got a letter from someone he didn't know. The center said they had worked at the Burke site for a short time years ago and seen scary things. It talked about sounds coming from the basement at night, rooms that stayed locked, and Evelyn's strict rules about which parts of the house were allowed to be used. Not at all allowed. The letter didn't give a name or way to get in touch. It only made vague hints that made people suspicious without providing proof. Benjamin put the letter away and added it to the growing collection of clues that could not be used to make an official accusation. Benjamin's anger was similar to that of Martin Crawford and everyone else who had tried to solve the Burke case. The AIs seemed untouchable. Her high social status and a system that required impossible things kept them safe. The standards of proof that apply in this case. In the meantime, the mansion stood tall, its foundations firmly set in the rock of the Appalachians. Its secrets were kept safe in rooms that never saw daylight. Even though time went by, some truths stayed the same, waiting for the time when they could no longer be held back. In 1929, the Great Depression hit the United States. It caused a lot of pain and changed the lives of millions of people. In the mountains of Kentucky, where poverty had always been a problem, the effects were terrible. Families lost their land. Workers wandered the roads looking for work, and people's faces showed that they were hopeless as they aged too quickly. The Burke mansion seemed even more out of place in this state of economic chaos. It was like an island of somber stability in the middle of the chaos. To everyone's surprise, Evelyn Burke seemed to have endless money, even as banks closed and fortunes disappeared. She took care of her property, paid her taxes, and bought supplies without any doubt. Some people thought that the family's gold might be hidden in the mansion. Others talked about hidden investments that had been safe during the market crash. The truth is that no one was sure where her money came from, and no one was brave enough to ask her directly. In those hard times, there were a lot more wandering men on the roads than ever before. Crossing those mountains in search of something better was done by displaced workers, veterans without jobs, and young men running away from farms that had gone bankrupt. For Evelyn, this huge amount of potential. Targets offered chances that had never been seen before. Men who were desperate were less careful, more likely to take offers from strangers, and less likely to question small problems if they meant they could sleep outside instead. A pretty man named James Mitchell went through the area in 1931. He only had a worn-out backpack and stories about people with closed minds when he came from West Virginia. James was just over 30 years old, but he looked like he was much older, like he had worked hard and been let down over time. As night fell near the Burke property, he didn't think twice about accepting the invitation of the beautiful woman who came up to offer shelter. He would never look back on the choice he made. It had been months since James's wife, Clara Ara, heard anything. She had stayed with her family while he looked for work. When she finally got the money to go to Kentucky along the last known path her husband took, she was met with silence and vague answers. The locals weren't very helpful because they were used to hearing stories of missing people. Clara was determined to find out what was going on, so she knocked on the door of the Burke mansion one fall afternoon. Evelyn greeted her with what seemed like sympathy. She worriedly listened to Clara's story and confirmed that a man fitting the description had asked for shelter months before. But she reassured her that he had left the next morning with food and directions to the nearest town. There was something off about that meeting. Clara could feel it. There is a disconnect between the friendly words and the coldness in eyes of Evelyn. But she couldn't do anything but keep looking for ghosts because she didn't have any proof, a body, or witnesses. Heiress spent weeks in the area talking to anyone who would talk. They met that way. Martin Crawford was now a middle-aged man whose file on the Burkes had grown a lot. He told her what he had found, showed her the clear pattern, and told her why the police weren't doing anything. Clara left Kentucky in the end, but not before promising that the truth about Evelyn Burke would be told. It would be found out, even if it took decades. In the meantime, the house kept living its strange life. Strange lights were sometimes seen in the windows early in the morning by neighbors who lived far away. Sounds that could be heard all over the valley on very quiet nights, and people moving on the grounds when they should have been empty. Some said that these findings were the result of people's imaginations being too aroused by rumors. Some people didn't want to think too much about what really happened on that remote land. How easy it is to... The community's surface peace was kept up by people who chose to be ignorant. Unexpected events in 1933 brought the Burke house back into the public's eye. A small fire hurt a part of the roof, so Evelyn had to hire people from the area to fix it. A young man named Daniel Warren, one of the carpenters, went down to the basement by mistake to look for old tools that might be useful. What he saw there really upset him. Daniel later told his close friends about a heavy metal door he found that was partly hidden behind some old bookshelves. It had more than one lock, was thick for an inner door, and gave off a strange smell when he got close to it. Before he could look into it any further, Evelyn sped up behind him, which was fast for someone his age. Even though her voice was still friendly, it was clear that she meant business when she told him to go back to work on the roof and never go down to the basement again. Daniel finished the job quickly and wouldn't go back to the house, even when Evelyn offered to pay him more for small mistakes. Fixes in the future. He only talked about what happened in secret. He never made a formal complaint. People around the Burkes had such a strong culture of quiet that even proof of wrongdoing was kept as a personal secret and not talked about in public. Daniel eventually moved to a different city, far away from those oppressive mountains, where he kept his unspoken thoughts to himself. The years of the Great Depression were very long, but they finally came to an end. Evelyn Burke was over 60 years old, but she was still in the house, stayed the same. People in the area told stories about her, and she had almost become a local celebrity. Kids in the area were told not to go near the Burke land, but parents rarely told their kids why they were being told not to. It was just thought that the place had a darkness that couldn't be explained by logic. Martin Crawford kept adding papers to his file, which was getting too big to carry around easily. He had become almost as obsessed as the people he called lazy for ignoring the solid proof. His wife was worried about how much time this job was taking up. But Martin thought it was the right thing to do to keep the record. Somebody had to remember. Someone had to write down. Even if justice never came in his lifetime, it was his personal duty to fight the ease of getting away with crimes that Evelyn's social status allowed. In the early 1940s, the country was once again in the grip of war. Young men all over the country joined the military or were drafted, and the woods of Kentucky were no different. Whole villages. Women took on jobs that were once only for men, and older people took care of the land while their sons and grandsons crossed the ocean to fight in faraway wars. As time went on, the Burke house stayed on the edges of these larger changes, happening at its own steady pace. Evelyn was 70 years old when World War II started. For her age, she seemed to be in very good health, but she wasn't seen outside the house very often these days. Messengers brought supplies, and they then left. The goods at the front gate and quickly left, following clear directions. After that point, not many people were allowed to go inside, and those who did were filled with a mix of morbid interest and real fear. During this time, Evelyn was given some occasional care by a nurse named Margaret Sullivan. Margaret was a seasoned worker who had previously worked in hospitals in cities before moving back to her home area. Rumors and myths didn't bother her, and she went about her work with practicality in medicine. She only saw a chance to help an elderly woman who lived alone when she took the job at the Burke house. In the coming weeks, her view would change in a big way. Margaret checked on Evelyn 3 times a week, taking her blood pressure, giving her medicine, and looking for signs of age-related decline. While she was there, she started to notice things that weren't quite right. Evelyn told Margaret she could only stay in certain rooms on the upper floor. Whole parts of the house were locked with multiple padlocks and made off limits. When Margaret asked Evelyn about these rules, she gave her a vague answer about upcoming repairs or structural problems. The sounds were even more upsetting. Margaret often heard sounds coming from deep inside the house. The thick walls made the sounds sound metallic. Evelyn always thought it was because of the old plumbing, the way the wood changed with the seasons, or the wind blowing through the cracks in the walls. A 100-year-old building. Each of the answers made sense on its own, but when put together over weeks, they made sense. They made a pattern that Margaret's logical mind couldn't fully understand. In January 1943, Margaret came over for her usual visit on a very cold afternoon and found the front door open. She called Evelyn several times but never got a response. Margaret carefully entered the house because she thought the old woman might have fallen or had a medical problem. She searched the familiar rooms without finding her. She finally found the stairs that led to the basement and found her patient. I had never seen the top door open before. Margaret slowly went down, calling Evelyn's name as she went. Her flashlight helped her see in the damp darkness. The cellar was bigger than she thought it would be. It went deeper than the structure above hinted. There were old tools hanging on the walls and dusty preserves stacked on shelves. Barrels were stacked in dark corners. Everything looked like it had been left alone for years, except for one troubling detail. There are fresh tracks in the dusty floor that lead to a certain part of the stone wall. Evelyn's voice echoed behind Margaret before she could look into it any further. The old woman had quietly shown up at the top of the stairs, where her shape could be seen against the light from the second floor. Her voice was polite as usual, but it also had a hardness to it that made no one question her. She told Margaret that she had forgotten to lock the basement door when she went out into the yard for a short time. she asked Margaret to go back upstairs for the regular checkup. Her tone didn't make it easy to talk. Margaret climbed slowly, but her heart was beating fast for some reason she couldn't quite explain. The meeting went as planned, but there was a permanent change in the way they interacted with each other. Evelyn was looking at her more closely now, with her clear eyes following the nurse around. When Margaret left that afternoon, she felt both relieved to be leaving that house and increasingly sure that something deeply wrong was going on. Not right there. Margaret had scary dreams about what might be hidden in that house the next few nights. Of course, she knew the stories. Everyone in the area did. But hearing stories about strange things happening wasn't the same as seeing them for yourself and feeling the heavy air in those dark hallways. Margaret thought about calling the police. But what would she really say? It seemed like she was afraid for no reason, heard strange sounds, and found some doors locked. Neither. That proved a crime had been committed. Martin Crawford's name came up in conversation about the Burke mystery, so she chose to talk to him. Martin met her at his house. He was a gentleman now with gray hair and serious eyes, and he listened carefully as she told her story. It didn't seem to surprise him. All he did was add Margaret's notes to his already large file. He showed her decades' worth of paperwork and drawings that tried to figure out how the mansion was put together based on different stories. There were guests and long lists of people who were missing. Margaret was both amazed and scared by how deep Martin's investigation went. It was clear that she had found something much bigger than she thought at first. Martin talked about how frustrated he was that the government hadn't done anything about the Burkes for decades, and that the secrets were being kept hidden by layers of quiet and cooperation. He had spent a lot of his adult life writing about that is not a defense, but they don't have the power to make a real probe happen. They talked about their choices together. During her visits, Margaret could try to find more information, look for solid proof, and write down anything that seemed fishy, but both of them knew the risks. Evelyn Burke had lived through decades of suspicion because she was careful and got rid of risks before they became dangerous. Margaret was well aware of what could happen if she was seen as a real danger, but fear and moral anger were still going on, causing her to struggle with an inner conflict she couldn't settle. In the weeks that followed, Margaret kept coming to see them, but this time she paid more attention. She tried to mentally map out the mansion's internal structure by remembering how the rooms were set up and paying attention to small details. Evelyn looked like she knew about the change. She became even more careful around the nurse. It got harder to have long talks and shorter consultations. With each meeting, the strain between them grew, like a rope being stretched to its limit. Mary found in March 1943. Something that would make everything different. Evelyn was out of the room for a short time during a visit, but she found a small notebook tucked between the seats of an old armchair. She quickly turned the pages over on a whim. The writing was very old-fashioned, and the dates were from decades ago. The names were ones she didn't know, and the numbers could be measures or amounts. Even though the situation wasn't made clear, the way everything was written down suggested that there was a careful record of something that had to be kept hidden. Mary Ann. I didn't have time to read more. In the hallway, Evelyn's steps could be heard. When the older woman came back, she quickly put the notebook back and stood up straight like a professional. Evelyn didn't say anything right away if she thought something was wrong. However, Margaret got a message that night telling her that she would no longer be needed. The note was nice and thanked her for her hard work. It also offered her good pay for the remaining weeks of the contract. There was no reason given, besides a hazy mention of Evelyn's changing medical care needs. Margaret understood what was being said. Evelyn was taking it away before it got worse because she had crossed an imaginary line. The nurse was both happy and angry at the same time. She was glad she wouldn't have to go back to that stuffy house. She was angry that she was so close to finding something important. She told Martin about the notebook event and he carefully wrote it down, but they both knew that memories of quickly. Page flipping wasn't proof that could be used in court. The months that followed were calm. The war was still going on in faraway places. Radio and newspapers brought news late, and life in the mountains went on at a pace that was typical of the past. Evelyn Burke stayed in her house and became more and more alone. People who knew or suspected her felt like they were being haunted by a ghost. Martin Crawford kept up with his paperwork work, sometimes with Margaret's help, who had become a friend in his silence. Battle. And deep inside that building, which was hundreds of years old, there were secrets waiting to be told. The walls would not let them out. When World War II ended in 1945, the whole country went through a time of change. When soldiers came back, their experiences had changed them in ways they could never fully explain. As communities mourned losses and hailed wins, a new era of economic growth slowly began to take shape. Even though they came slowly and through filters in the mountains of Kentucky, these changes did happen. Still, they came, but the Burke house stayed the same as it always had been. A strange place and time where the past refused to give way to the present. Burke was more than 75 years old now. Finally, her looks were starting to show more clearly how much time had passed. Her hair was fully white. She stooped a little, and her hands had age spots on them, but her eyes still had that sharp intelligence and penetrating clarity that had always made her stand out. She kept her secrets until the very end, no matter what that very end looked like, even after decades of being suspected and generations of amateur detectives tried to figure them out. Martin Crawford, a guy in his 60s now, felt the weight of getting older and more angry. His file on the Burkes took up 3 locked wooden boxes in his attic and was made up of decades' worth of detailed paperwork that only he and a few close friends had fully looked over. 2 years ago, his wife had died. His kids had moved too. He moved to bigger cities in search of better chances, but he found himself spending more and more time alone with the obsession that had shaped most of his adult life. Margaret Sullivan stayed in the area and worked as a visiting nurse for a number of different patients. She kept in touch with Martin from time to time, exchanging information whenever it was appropriate. She would never forget her short time at the Burke house. She had a strong feeling that she had only seen the surface of something much darker and more disturbing. I often wondered what was in that notebook that she had quickly looked through, the names and numbers that made me think of a scary list of horrible things that had happened. In 1947, something big happened that threw off the normal schedule. A group of unemployed war veterans who had just come back from duty decided to explore the mountains in search of hunting chances and maybe start some kind of tourism business. They didn't know much about the past of the area. Some of them had grown up in other parts of all over the country and ended up in Kentucky by accident. They didn't know about the stories about the Burke land when they set up camp there. Frank Morrison, a veteran, was one of them who went near the house one morning. He wasn't trying to hurt them. He was just interested in the amazing building he had seen through the trees. When he found Evelyn in the yard, he greeted her nicely and said something nice about how nice the house looked. Evelyn was shocked at first, but quickly calmed down and said thank you. Thanked him for the praise and casually said that men who were walking alone sometimes got lost in those forests and that they should let their friends know where they were. Frank thought the comment was strange. The way she said it, the way her voice changed, and the look that lasted a second longer than usual stood out. He felt uneasy after that meeting that he couldn't put into words. When he got back to camp, he told his friends about what happened. A man from the area who had joined the group looked clearly upset when. Frank told us exactly where the place was. After that, the stories started to be told. For people from outside the area who weren't used to the silence, Rumors that had been building up for decades were finally put into words. Even though soldiers had been through a lot and were less easily affected by things than regular people, they were still interested. They had seen horrible things on battles in Europe and on islands in the Pacific. But there was something about the way those stories were told and the real fear in the locals' eyes that hit home, apparently disturbingly. Thomas Grant, a former military investigator, thought it was something that should be looked into further. He knew how to gather data by putting together pieces of information that were spread out and seeing patterns where other people only saw coincidences. When soldiers started to ask questions in the city, Martin Crawford's name kept coming up. Thomas went to find him. Both of them learned a lot from their meeting. Martin finally had someone who really knew how to do investigations interested in his work, and Thomas got access to evidence that went above and beyond his wildest hopes. They went through the files for days, with Thomas using critical skills he had learned in the military. When he trained his eye, patterns became more clear. Thomas was most interested in questions about how things would work. How had Evelyn Burke been able to work for so long without being caught? Where was the machinery that she was thought to be using for her activities? In a time before computers, how did she get rid of evidence? He came to the conclusion that the answers must be in the mansion's design and the land around it. The Burke estate was very big and included forests that were never properly marked. The house itself had been added onto and changed over many generations. Using old maps from county records, Thomas started to piece together the building history of the Burke house. Evelyn's grandfather had built the original structure, but records showed that it had been added on too many times, including excavations that were supposedly for storage for coal. These underground rooms were linked to the mining operations that had made the family rich decades before. This made a network of tunnels that went far beyond the house's obvious edges. It was the best place to hide because it could only be reached through controlled entrances and no one could see inside. Thomas told the state authorities what he had found in the hopes that an outside look would finally lead to an official probe. He put together an in-depth report with copies of Martin's file papers, annotated maps and transcripts of evidence from a number of different sources. He thought that the fact that he was a decorated veteran and had been a military investigator would give more weight to accusations that earlier generations had not been able to prove. Thomas was well prepared and had a lot of experience, but he still didn't realize how powerful Burke was in local politics. His report went to many offices and led to some official meetings, but it finally ran into the same problems that had made Martin so angry. For many years, a search of the property without bodies or witnesses ready to testify under oath was illegal because there was no physical evidence that could be disputed. For generations, the Burke family gave money to political campaigns and had friends in key roles. Even though they had been dead for decades, the family name still protected the last heir. Thomas was furious that the institutions that he had risked his life to protect were not doing anything. He had been fighting for justice in other countries, only to find that those same principles were being ignored at home. Selectively applied in his own country when it suited his own goals. His anger was similar to Martin's, but it was worse because he thought that stepping in from the outside would make a difference. The truth was more complicated and disappointing than either of them had thought. Thomas made a choice in October 1948 that would change the way things went. He and 2 other veterans chose to look into the Burke land on their own, without anyone else's permission. They carefully planned, picking a night with no moon and getting ready. They came prepared with flashlights and tools. They planned to look around the outside of the property, look for openings to the underground tunnels Thomas thought existed, and take pictures that could lead to an official investigation. Martin tried to talk them out of it by telling them about the legal and personal risks, but the soldiers were set on doing it. The night trip got off to a good start. They were able to sneak around the property's perimeter without being seen by using methods they had learned for silent movement. While the military is operating, they found a number of damaged outbuildings that were old buildings connected to mining activities. In one of them, they found a partly blocked entrance that led down to a network of tunnels cut into the rock. The findings supported Thomas's ideas about the underground infrastructure that was being kept secret. But before they could look around some more, the mansion's lights came on. Even though Evelyn Burke was very old, she was surprisingly careful with her property. She set off a makeshift alarm system of bells linked by wires around the perimeter that went off when someone broke in. When the veterans heard the metallic sounds booming through the night, they knew they should run away. It was already important that they had found proof of the underground infrastructure, and they didn't want to get into a fight that could lead to criminal charges. When Thomas got back to camp, he took pictures of his own notes and maps to record the exact position of the tunnel entrance, what they had found. He was going to take everything to the state prosecutor's office in the morning and say that they now had solid proof of an unreported underground structure that needed an official probe. It was only a thin thread of hope, but it was more than any other detective had been able to find. But Evelyn Burke had not lived through so many decades of taking threats without fighting back. Early the next morning, before Thomas could share his findings, the sheriff of the area showed up at the soldiers' camp. Evelyn had made an official complaint about trespassing and shown proof that someone had broken onto her land overnight. Anonymous witnesses were said to have seen armed men near the mansion, which led to a threat story that was totally false. The veterans were put on the defensive all of a sudden, and their results were tainted by the fact that they were gotten in an illegal way. Thomas tried to give the sheriff some background on his reasons, but he wasn't interested in philosophical talk, arguments about what is right versus what is acceptable. The laws against trespassing were clear, and the veterans had officially broken them, no matter what their reasons were. Official warnings were given to them, along with the not-so-subtle advice that they should leave the area before more serious charges were brought against them. Even though Burke's impact had been passed down through generations and turned into political capital that was hard to pinpoint, it was still enough to keep Evelyn from being looked at too closely. A few days later, the soldiers left, angry but aware that their efforts were pointless, of keeping fighting a system that made it clear it didn't want to be messed with. Michael was given copies of all of the Thomas's study by Martin. This included the pictures and maps of the underground structures. That's all they could do, keep the information safe and hold out hope that the truth will come out one day. Martin added these papers to his collection, which was getting so big that he had forgotten how many cases he was writing about. His own crusade went on, apparently by himself and without anyone else, against a wrong that had been going on for decades with institutions staying quiet. It wasn't until the 1950s that changes in culture and technology finally reached even the most remote parts of Appalachia. As time went on, roads were paved, phone lines were extended, and TVs were sent to homes in rural areas, linking towns that were once cut off from the rest of the world. The Burke mansion, on the other hand, was a unique exception because it refused to be updated. Evelyn actually never set up a phone. She never let electricians extend wires to her property, and she kept her home in a state of almost anistic isolation on purpose. She turned 80 years old in 1952. People in the community talked in whispers about how she had lived so long and what had kept her alive when so many other women her age had already died. Some people thought her long life was due to strong genes. Some people used darker language to talk about strange agreements and stolen powers. There were logical and religious theories, but everyone agreed on one thing. There was something amazing and disturbing about Evelyn Burke's determination. It was now the end of Martin Crawford's life. His health was slowly getting worse. Writing was hard for him because of arthritis, and his eyesight was getting worse from years of reading papers in dim light. But he stayed alert and would sometimes add new information to the archive that had become his life's work. Mary Ann. Sullivan kept visiting him on a regular basis, but not as a working partner anymore. Instead, he did it to see the amazing commitment of a man who would not let injustice go unpunished. While he was there, on a rainy April afternoon in 1953, Martin finally said out loud something he had been thinking about for years. He was old. He didn't have any heirs who wanted to carry on his crusade, and all the information he had gained could have died with him. Margaret, who was now the only person he could really trust, would need to figure out what to do with the paperwork he left behind after he died. She hadn't asked for this heavy duty, but it seemed like she was doomed to carry it. Margaret took the duty as seriously as it called for. Together, they made the archive more organized by adding indexes and summaries that would help someone in the future quickly understand how big the study was. Martin wrote a long opening that explained how the project started and why it kept going even though. All of his anger and the hope he still had that the truth would win out in the end. It was a manifesto, a will, and a call to future generations all at the same time. At the same time, whispers started going around that something was different at the Burke mansion. Neighbors who lived far away noticed that there wasn't as much going on as normal. They saw less smoke coming from the chimneys and no sign of the messengers who used to show up every once in a while. Some people thought Evelyn was finally giving up and that her days were numbered. That her death would finally put an end to this sad part of local history. It was almost like you could feel the anticipation and the sense that something was ending. It was in June 1954 that Martin Crawford died gently in his sleep. Few people came to his service because he wanted it to be private, but those who did know, they were saying goodbye to a man who had spent decades trying to get justice where others had given up. Margaret took his boxes full of papers and put them somewhere safe in her own house. She hadn't yet. She wasn't sure what she would do with that heritage, but she was determined to keep it until the right time came. Strange news spread through the community just 3 months after Martin's death in September 1954. Evelyn Burke had died. A messenger found her body in the house, sitting in her favorite chair in the library. It looked like she had left during the night. There were no signs of fighting or violence. There was only an old woman who had finally reached the end that she knew was coming, of having lived a very long time. People had different reactions to the news. There was both relief that the unsettling presence was gone and a sense of missed chances and questions that would never have straight answers. The will of Evelyn Burke turned out to be a strange document. Nobody close to her could claim the land as her direct heir. The document said that the house and all of its land should be given to the county, but only if the building was kept exactly as it was. For 50 years, no changes or demolitions are allowed. It also set up a small fund for simple repairs that would keep the roof in good shape and stop the building from falling apart completely, but nothing more. People who had thought that the property would finally be thoroughly searched were shocked by the preservation clause. The county was formally required by the will to accept the gift. By law, the Burke house was now like a time capsule that was stuck in its last moments. State for 50 years. Some saw this as Evelyn's last act of control, making sure that no one would find out her lies after she died. Others thought it was just the last strange thing about a woman who had always done things her own way. When Evelyn died, Margaret Sullivan saw a chance she couldn't miss. The mansion is now public property, though there are some restrictions set by the law. This means that an official probe should be possible. She called the state. Authorities showed parts of Martin's file and said that the owner's death got rid of many of the legal issues that had stopped earlier investigations. Because she kept at it, the house was finally inspected by a real person. In November 1954, the county sheriff, a structural engineer, and a state detective made up a small team that inspected the building. Margaret got permission to go with them as a citizen observer, which was kind of Martin's job. Lawrence. When they went into the house for the first time since Evelyn's death, they saw that it had been preserved in a way that made it seem like the owner could come back at any time. The main floor only had old, dusty books, antique furniture, and personal items from a person who had chosen to live alone. On the second floor, there were rooms that hadn't been used in decades, beds with sheets that were yellow from use, and closets full of clothes that smelled like mothballs. It was the basement held the secrets that people for generations had thought about but never found a way to prove. The team went down the stairs with bright flashlights that lit up dark areas that didn't see much light during the day. The main basement was as described above. It was a large room with shelves full of old jams, tools, and other things that would normally be found in a self-sufficient home. The structural expert, on the other hand, saw something that no one else had. When comparing the cellar's size to that of the building above, they did not match. There was unaccounted for space, which suggests that there are more rooms hidden behind what look like walls. Following their gut, they started to look more closely at the stone walls. They found the door behind a heavy cabinet that was attached to the wall but could be moved with enough force. It was thick and heavy, made of metal that had been strengthened, and it had many locks that were slightly rusted but still worked. The keys were finally found in Evelyn's room, in a small box with her personal items, with a bunch of. They worked hard to open each lock one at a time until the door finally gave way, making a steel groan that echoed in the dark basement. What they found behind that door proved what they had been thinking for decades and went beyond their worst fears. A stone staircase cut right into the solid rock of the mountain led to a level that was even deeper. The air coming from below was cold, damp, and smelled like something that the team couldn't quite put their finger on but knew was related to death and time standing still. Taking flashlights and careful breathing, they started to go down into the rooms that Evelyn Burke had kept locked up her whole life. It turned out that the underground rooms were bigger than any investigator had thought. There were many branches off of the narrow corridors. Some led to small spaces carved into the rock, while others ended suddenly in solid walls. The creativity of the architecture was amazing, and showed that a lot of work had gone into planning it for decades. That area was made to stay out of sight and protect. There are things that should never be told. Margaret Sullivan went with the team through those tunnels feeling both relieved and scared. Everything Martin Crawford had written down during decades of working alone on the case was being proven right in front of her eyes. The rumors, suspicions, and stories that were written off as rural exaggerations all had parts of truth that could no longer be ignored. The depth of what Evelyn Burke had been able to hide for so long was mind-boggling. The official probe took several weeks. A team of experts was sent in. Records were put into a database. There were pictures and maps made of every part of those cameras. The Burke house became the center of attention in the state, with reporters there to get news. People are waiting at the gates to see what's going on, and the authorities are trying to keep some control over what's happening. It was like decades of forced silence had finally burst into news that could not be held back. Margaret gave us that Martin Crawford's whole archive was used in the probe. Decades of records that now had new meanings. The names he had written down, the trends he had seen, and the links he had found all fit into a much bigger and darker picture. Martin's work was finally recognized, and his determination was rewarded, but he was too sick to see the justice he had worked so hard for. What was found in the underground rooms made people wonder how someone could have been able to work for so long. Without being caught, about the flaws in the system that let fears go unnoticed, and about how power and social position kept the powerful from being questioned. The community had to face a reckoning as a whole, admitting that it had been passively involved, kept quiet when it was convenient, and chosen to ignore suspicions when they emerged. Over the next few months, agents tried to find possible victims and contact their families. It took a long time and was painful. A lot of. The men who went missing were lone travelers with no strong ties to anyone, and their disappearances were never properly probed. Some families finally got answers to questions they had been carrying around for decades. It was a late but important end. Others would never know for sure what happened to their loved ones. They would live in a state of unconfirmed fears. Burke Manor became a lasting reminder of how evil can grow when people choose to ignore unpleasant facts because they are easier to deal with. The building stood as it was, as Evelyn's will said it should, but its appearance changed from a silent threat to an unintentional memorial to how flawed people are. Visitors would sometimes stop at the gates to look at the crumbling building and think about the secrets that its walls had kept for so long. Margaret Sullivan lived for another 20 years after those events, where she continued Martin Crawford's work and talked about what she saw. Many times, she thought about how history might have been different if people had listened to the warnings years earlier, before. If social status hadn't made shields of safety, if political and social concerns hadn't often gotten in the way of justice. Her thoughts were angry, but they also held hope that she would learn from them. Over the years, the Burke house slowly fell apart, even though not much was done to keep it in good shape. Nature started to take back the place that people had built on for a while. The outside walls were covered with vines. Not one of the tiles that fell was replaced. Windows broke and stayed broken, open to the weather. It looked like the building was slowly falling apart from the weight of the secrets it had kept, as if it could no longer support its own weight now that its dark purpose was known. The story of Evelyn Burke became part of local folklore, going from being a whispered tale to a true story that was told as a warning. Books, films, and the stories that people tell each other about traumatic events help future generations understand what happened. The name Burke became a sign of. With long-lasting lies, with how perfect looks can hide deeply disturbing traits, and with how silence lets horrible things happen without being noticed. For safety reasons, the underground chambers were finally sealed off and filled with concrete to keep them from collapsing and stop people from getting in without permission. It felt like burying the secrets a second time, but this time it wasn't to hide them. It was just what had to be done. Those areas were taken back by the mountain, which turned them back into rocks. Not possible to get to except through photographs and accounts from people who saw them before the final sealing. We went on a trip through one of the scariest stories these mountains have ever told. It's a warning that bad things don't always show up in clear-cut ways, that it hides behind respectable facades and is protected by social systems that value comfort over truth. People who wouldn't take no for an answer kept going until they finally brought light where there was darkness. It had rained for many years. Burke's style doesn't exist in the way we know it from this story. The work that people started has been finished by time, and the elements turning that huge building into partial ruins that barely show how it was originally built. But the story lives on, told from one generation to the next as a warning about being careful, questioning authority, and never letting your social status protect you from being looked at. If this story moved you in any way, please. You can follow more stories that look into the dark sides of history by subscribing to the channel. Every story we tell teaches us something about people, society, and how our decisions, both as individuals and as a group, affect the world around us. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to click like if you like this trip through one of the most upsetting parts of the Appalachians.